Hello and welcome to the February edition of the Park County Community Foundation's Nonprofit Network Series. Today we are joined by Nico Woodcoase, who is joining us from down in Mammoth Hot Springs. Nico is a grant writer, an interpretive park ranger, and a professional storyteller. And she has a PhD in communication, which I didn't even know was a thing. So that's already been a big learning for me. Nico has written more than 30 successful grant proposals to city, county, and state level agencies, and also universities, nonprofit groups, and philanthropic organizations. She's very active down there in the Gardner community. She chairs the grants committee for Electric Peak Arts Council and oversees evaluation and distribution of grants by North Yellowstone Education Foundation, who has a program, the Connect program. So Nico is both a grant writer and a grant evaluator. As I mentioned, she lives in Mammoth Hot Springs with her husband and two daughters. And we are so grateful to have Nico here to talk to us today about how to successfully pitch your project.
So thank you for that wonderful introduction, Barb. You already pretty much covered my first two slides, so that's great. So this presentation is called Pitching Your Project, Using Credibility, Passion, and Logic to Make a Compelling Case for Funders. You just heard my bio, but here's a cute picture of my kids that you can see if you would like. And here's all right, so I first came to grant writing to fund my own artistic work as a theater artist. So my background's in communication and theater. So that's how I kind of got interested in grants. But grant writing seemed to combine so many of my interests because as a scholar of communication, I was really interested in the ways that I could analyze requests for proposals to learn more about what a specific funder or organization was seeking. And as a storyteller and as a writer, I was really interested in playing with language and figuring out how I could choose the correct words to get the response I was seeking. But then as an instructor of public speaking, so while I was in graduate school studying communication, I worked for the university as a teacher. I taught public speaking. So as a public speaking teacher, I was interested in how I could use persuasion and what I knew about that topic to try and make a compelling case for any project that I was seeking funding for. So that's how I kind of made the switch from writing grants just for myself to do fun things that I wanted to do to professionally writing grants for other organizations. As Barb mentioned, I live in Mammoth. I've been in this region for about 6 years, and I do work for a number of different nonprofits in the region as a grant writer and as a consultant. So in this presentation, we're going to talk about all my favorite things about grant writing. We're going to talk about how telling a great story is really what's at the heart of any good pitch. We're going to talk about how you can read through the lines in any request for proposals to kind of glean additional information about what they're looking for. But we are going to spend most of our time talking about persuasion and specifically the 3 rhetorical appeals that you might remember from your own experience in Speech 101. And those are ethos, pathos, and logos. And then we're going to end with a little bit of practical application of what we're talking about, hopefully that you can use in upcoming grant applications that you're putting together. So writing a pitch, writing a grant, like any form of writing, is a very simple yet very arduous task. Probably the most challenging thing about it is that when you sit down to the blank page, you're left alone with your thoughts. Or as author Elizabeth Gilbert puts it, creativity is a crushing chore and a glorious mystery. On some very special occasions, the ideas you need to communicate come spilling forth. Bam, inspiration. The muse sits on the edge of your desk and you are exhilarated to fill pages and pages with your words. But this exalting creativity, although it's probably what made you feel like you could even be a writer in the first place, it's it actually is a detriment to the whole process because that feeling, it hardly ever comes along and it never stays long enough for you to actually complete anything that you need to get done. Instead, you really need to will yourself to write when you have no inspiration, and instead your mind is filled only with the words of your own doubt. So this is exactly how I felt when I had to write my doctoral dissertation, and I would like to take just 2 minutes to tell you a little bit about that experience. So by the time I reached the final lap of my PhD, I had already been a dutiful student for 23 years. And being a student meant following instructions, which I was very, very good at. But then they cut me loose. They said, you've learned everything that we need to teach you, and now it's time for you to contribute new knowledge to the field of communication. And I already knew my topic and I'd already done a buttload of research, but I couldn't figure out how to commit any words to the page. And I'm not going to bore you with the exact topic of my dissertation, but you can trust that it was both immeasurably specific and a smidgen pretentious, which is the norm. But I couldn't write, so I found a million other ways to do things that were related to writing until my schedule was so full and busy that I didn't have time to even worry about writing. And I kept on in that way for an entire year. And so rather than completing my PhD in 4 years as I had intended, I found myself turning the corner into year number 5. And it was then that 2 things happened. First, Rafael, my partner, who was exhausted by living in Southern Illinois anymore, as well as waiting for me to finish my 3rd degree, he decided to take a summer job in Yellowstone National Park, and he left for Wyoming. 2 days after he was gone, I discovered that we were going to be expecting our first child. So I really needed to find a way to write the dang thing. And because the project was too big when I looked at it all together, I decided to slice it down into manageable pieces. And I decided that I was going to just write 2 pages a day. Just 2 pages a day. It seemed really simple and really doable and something that I could dedicate myself to. And on top of that, I only made myself do it 5 days a week. But just by dedicating myself to the daily task of writing in a regimented way, muses be damned, I was able to turn out a 40-page chapter every month. And by the time Rafael returned from that summer gig in Yellowstone National Park, I possessed a great boulder of a belly and 5 long chapters of text. So in essence, I gestated my firstborn child and my scholarly life's work as though they were twins. And on January 10th, 2015, both of my babies were at full term. I was 37 weeks pregnant and I turned in my dissertation. And when I defended it, my daughter, who'd given me the strength to write it in the first place, was earthside, asleep against my chest. Communication theorist Walter R. Fisher calls human beings homo narrans, explaining that it is fundamental to human nature to make sense of our world through stories. Anytime we speak to people, we have the ability to fuse their minds and bodies with what David G.P. Phillips calls the angel cocktail, composed of dopamine, oxytocin, and endorphins. And we can do this by telling stories and fostering empathy. So I took a little bit of your time to tell you a story from my life in the hopes that this would spike your own angel cocktail hormones, making you feel a little bit more at ease and maybe even a little bit more connected to me as a speaker. Because most of the time, most people, they're walking around in a state of disquietude. Rather than this angel cocktail of hormones, they are probably churning out stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline, or what Phillips calls the devil cocktail. So when we pitch an idea to someone, even if it's in written form, we really want to think about how we can lower their stress levels and put them at ease by telling a great story. I'm sure it's no surprise that when you're in a more positive and calm brain state, people are going to be more likely to want to approve what you're proposing. But what even is a pitch? Traditionally, we think of an elevator pitch as a 2-minute description of your project that includes all of the relevant information you would want a potential supporter to know. This pitch is something you should be able to memorize and have in your back pocket just in case you ever find yourself riding in the elevator with Warren Buffett. But clearly, in today's world, we don't really have a lot of occasion for elevators or even seeing people in person at all. But the concept of the pitch is still powerful because you should be able to describe your project succinctly, in detail, and with an air of enthusiasm. You should always have this pitch close at hand, ready to be expressed from memory, just in case this opportunity ever presents itself. It could be in a conference call or in a Zoom. You never really know when the moment might arrive. Additionally, this compendiary description of your project is useful in its written form, and it could come in handy if you need to type an email, send a newsletter, or for our purposes, more importantly, when you're writing a grant. Because everybody everywhere is busy, and you never want to take extra time, space, or characters to communicate something you could have said with less. So just to put that into perspective, the story that I told you from my life was 377 words, and it took less than 3 minutes for me to tell it to you. So as I mentioned earlier, I was an instructor of public speaking, and I taught public speaking for 7 years at the college level. So before we even get into that, I just want to acknowledge that I know most people detest public speaking, and we're not going to make anybody do any public speaking today, but I do believe it's one of the most valuable life skills that you can cultivate. And also, I do think that the building blocks of great speeches, especially persuasive speeches, provide excellent fundamentals for many different types of speaking and writing. So that's how we get to my homeboy Aristotle and his 3 rhetorical appeals. So remember that persuasion is at the heart of what we're trying to do with this pitch. And in many ways, it's already at the heart of what we're all doing in our nonprofit work all the time. We're always selling belief in our organization, confidence in our projects, trackable measures of our successes, and so on and so on. As successful grant writer Julie Quickla puts it, in a grant proposal, you're not reporting, you're selling. So Aristotle was transfixed by the arts of rhetoric and persuasion, and he divided the means of persuasion into these 3 categories: ethos, pathos, and logos. So I'm sure this is a review for most people, but when we think of ethos, we're talking about credibility and reliability. When we're talking about pathos, we're thinking about emotion and empathy. And when we're talking about logos, we're really talking about rationality and the presentation of facts. So Aristotle, in concert with just about every public speaking teacher to ever live, believed that if you crafted an argument that drew upon all 3 of these in an equal and balanced way, then you could create a really strong case for just about anything. But for our purposes, we're also going to use ethos, pathos, and logos to make our arguments more compact. We're going to use these ideas to guide what we keep in a pitch as well as what we leave out, thereby distilling our description down to its most essential elements. So in the story that I told you about my life, I used ethos, pathos, and logos in a few different ways. So in terms of my personal credibility, I flat out told you that I have a PhD, but I also tried to reveal myself as an authentic person who struggles with writing. In terms of pathos, I'm telling you about my baby. That's a big pull on the heartstrings for anybody, but I'm also talking about writing as though it is metaphorically a baby. So that could have some emotional impact as well. And then as far as logos, I am describing in a really rational and logical way how I was able to accomplish the task of writing my dissertation. So there are 4 elements that you should really include in a pitch. And if you put them together in a cohesive way, really they should tell a story. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about those 4 elements, right? So we've got ethos, pathos, logos, and then also your project description. I'm going to talk about each one of those in detail, and then I'm going to provide a more extended example of how they all work together. So do not dismay and wish for examples. They are coming just a little bit later. So first up, let's talk a little bit about your project description. Now, this lesson today, it kind of presupposes that you already know what your project is and that you already know the scope of your project. But if you don't have a project in mind or you don't really know the scope of your project, I would really recommend going back to the nonprofit network page and looking at the grant readiness workshop put together by the Dotted I, and I will provide a link to that at the end of this PowerPoint. But that's a really great place to start if you don't really know what your project is. But let's go ahead and just imagine that you do already know what your project is. You already know your way around your project. What you want to be able to do is to state it as simply and clearly as you can what it is. You want to be able to do that in 1 to 3 sentences max. And this project description is going to be utilitarian. It's your workhorse. It's not really the place for a lot of poetic language. Now, we will have space for that later, but just in terms of getting down a description of your project, you really want to talk as simply as you can about what you'll do, how you'll do it, when you do it, and really that's it. Okay. So once you know what your project is, then we can talk about how you can fuse it with these different persuasive appeals. And the first one we're going to talk about is pathos. For some reason, it's always listed with ethos first. Even in my overview at the beginning, it's always kind of ethos is the first one. But really, I think ethos is the last one that you should think about, because ethos it's a little bit more subtle and it's a little bit more complicated. And the other thing about ethos is that sometimes it's already accomplished by what you do with pathos and logos. So we're going to talk about pathos first, then logos, then ethos. Now, pathos, as we stated already, it's an emotional appeal. It's most commonly thought of as pulling at their heartstrings. And how you can get at pathos, especially thinking in the language of grant writing, is to think about needs, right? Who are you serving? What is the nature of their need? What might happen if this need is not met? And this is also a great way for you to communicate your passion for the work, right? Pathos, passion, they come from the same root word. So this is how you can really put some enthusiasm behind what you're talking about, and you can also communicate the timeliness of your project. And just as a personal stylistic choice, I always love to end a pitch on a note of pathos. I call it the pathos mic drop. It's a really great way to just end in a really great way and provide a lasting impression. Next up, we've got logo. So you've already stated your need in an impassioned way. Logic is going to come up behind, logos is going to come in and prove that need. So logos always has something to prove, is how I like to think about it. So the most obvious way to employ logos is to use facts like data, statistics, numbers, and that is really important. That is going to help you prove some of the claims that you're making in your pitch for in your grant. But it doesn't only have to be numbers and statistics. It can also just be a clarity of ideas, right? So you're employing logos if you can show us that your project makes sense, that your timeline seems rational, your budget seems sound, the whole entire thing just seems really like straightforward and doable. That's logos. And if you don't have already compiled kind of a list of stats and data that you can draw on for your grant, I will shout out another of the nonprofit network presentations, the one that was called Using Data to Tell Your Best Story. That has a lot of really great information for how you can kind of gather and have a little list of logos points that you can draw upon for pitches and grant apps. And I will also link to that one at the end. So now we can get into ethos. And remember that ethos is your credibility. So it's the impression of your character, intentions, and abilities that ultimately make you more or less believable to your audience. And generally speaking, there are two types of ethos. So we've got prior or extrinsic ethos, which is the credibility that you bring to your pitch because of your experience or reputation. So it's like things that you already have done before. And then we've got demonstrated or intrinsic credibility. And that's the credibility that you display through the actual act of communicating, through the words that you choose and through the way that you deliver them. But as a representative of a nonprofit, your credibility, it also has a few different layers to it, right? So first off, you've got the credibility of your organization, and that is going to be largely that prior or extrinsic credibility that we've talked about. So demonstrating the extrinsic credibility of your organization is something that I'm sure you're all already engaged in doing. It's a huge element of nonprofit work, and it's a long-term, ongoing effort that never ends. So it's not really something you can do in a pitch. It's going to be kind of more built up over time. So, ideally, in the most ideal circumstances, your organization already has like an established brand and a great reputation and some name recognition. And if you're not there yet, that's probably something you're already working on, and that is your organizational ethos. But then you also have the credibility of your project, right? We already talked about that a lot through logos, just like, is your project gonna really happen or not, okay? And then particularly in Montana, we also have our own special brand of credibility, which is local credibility, which is that, especially if you're communicating with local donors or local organizations, Montana folks, they like people who have community knowledge, firsthand experience of what they're talking about. There's a little bit of distrust of folks coming from the outside. So you can always, in really subtle ways, communicate that you know a particular area, that you have firsthand experience with that. So that's exactly why at the beginning of this presentation, I made sure to tell you that I live here and that I've been here for 6 years, which means, I'm not from here. I'll own that. But I've been here long enough to really know what it means to be a member of this particular community. So, in the pitch format, we can't worry too much about that demonstrated or extrinsic credibility. Instead, what we're going to focus on is our demonstrated credibility that we can kind of prove and advocate through the words that we choose. And we can do that in 3 ways. We can do it by sharing personal experience or firsthand knowledge. We can do it by providing sound research, and we can do it by following instructions. Now, that third one, following instructions, it might seem a little bit out of place on this list, but it's not. So as Barb mentioned at the beginning, not only am I a grant writer, but I also I'm on the handing out side of grants as well. So on my experience with review boards and on that side of the grant process, I can very much tell you that when grants come across that have not followed instructions in a variety of ways, like simple stuff, like maybe the budget isn't in the format we asked for, or maybe there's attachment that wasn't included, or maybe it didn't come on time, the reviewers do lose faith in the project when those little things are not met. And on the other hand, when a grant application, it comes in a tidy and timely way with all of the pieces in the right order, the way it's supposed to be, the reviewers have more confidence in the project itself, right? So it's just a really easy way to demonstrate that you know what you're doing. And on top of that, when reviewers get these nice, clean applications, it does give them a little boost of those angel cocktail hormones that we talked about. It just puts them in a better headspace to want to say yes to what you are proposing. But as far as the other two elements, you can very easily see that sharing personal experience, it has an emotional element, and providing sound research has a logical element. So the chances are that just by doing a really good job demonstrating ethos and pathos in your, demonstrating pathos and logos in your pitch or in your proposal, that you've already kind of ticked that ethos box as well. Okay, now I believe that ethos is the most important and the most powerful of the rhetorical appeals, but it doesn't really work by itself. It's actually kind of invisible all on its own. Rather, it is a comprehensive understanding of your pitch or of your organization or of your grant proposal. It's more like something that once you've put it together, you can kind of look back at it and sort of ask yourself if you've accomplished what you wanted to accomplish with ethos, if you come across credible, if your project comes across credible. So it's almost like that by highlighting pathos and logos, that ethos sort of reveals itself. So now that we've kind of talked across those four elements that you want to see in any pitch, I'm going to give you an example of all four of them and how they work together. So most of you don't have your video on. You don't have to turn it on, but I'm just sort of curious if anybody wants to let me know by a show of hands or in the chat box, how many of you have previously applied on the AMB West grant cycle, the AMB West Philanthropies Community Grant Cycle? So at least a few people have, quite a few people have. So as you know, in the past couple of years, they started requiring a 2-minute video to be a part of that grant packet. And that 2-minute video is an excellent example of a pitch, right? Because that video, the function of that video is to be able to show your grant project to people who don't want to or are not able to read your 20-page grant packet. So how do you take that 20-page grant packet with all of your wonderful research and detailed description and smash it down into a 2-minute video, right? So I didn't participate in the AMB West grant cycle this year, 2021, but I did work as a consultant for the Rural Schools 360 folks on their grant last year in 2020. And I made their video, and I am gonna show you that video. It's 2 minutes, right? And then afterwards, we're going to talk about how ethos, pathos, logos, and the project description are functioning in that text. And right now, we are just kind of going to focus on words. Obviously, images and audio and all of these things are other ways that you can definitely make an emotional impact, demonstrate all kinds of things. But for the sake of brevity and for our purposes today, we are going to focus on the words. Okay, so here we go.
What does rural mean to you? For us, it means unobstructed sunrises over mountains. It means breathtaking animals waltzing through our backyards. It means a snowmobile ride to and from school. Rural means both distance and connection, where the span between homes may be farther, yet the kinship between people is brass bound. Unfortunately, living in rural Park County can also mean lack of access to mental and behavioral health care. Statistics from the Center for Disease Control tell us that Montana is facing a mental health epidemic. And yet, if you look at figures from the Health Resources and Services Administration, we have less than a quarter of the recommended number of mental health care providers to serve our population. More often than not, children in rural communities do not have access to the tools they need to thrive. The Park County Special Education Co-op seeks to change this. With your support, we will work to provide mental and behavioral health services to students in Park County rural schools. We will hire both a behavior analyst and a school-based therapist who will work together across rural Park County. These positions will provide Tier 1 and Tier 2 interventions for students, as well as much needed support for staff, parents, and the community. We will also hire a project supervisor to ensure that this important work gets done. Park County is filled with people who value beauty over convenience, people who relish both self-reliance and collective community growth. Here in Park County, we are willing to make sacrifices for the lifestyle we love. The mental and behavioral health of our children should not be one of them.
All right, so we paid that voice actor very handsomely to do that video, I will have you know. But no, okay, so here's the full text of what the video said. And this first section right here is demonstrating that kind of local credibility that we talked about. It's using ethos. It's trying to tell the viewer that I know from personal experience what it means to live in a rural place. Then this next section is functioning more as pathos. And obviously it's not always black and white where one appeal ends and another appeal begins, because this also you could argue is more of that local credibility. But I was going for more of an emotional impact with the words that I chose and the way that I was putting it. And this next section is obviously using logos, right? Here's where I'm going to state some facts, some statistics, and I'm also going to cite my sources, which helps me seem credible as well, right? So it's always a good idea to cite your sources anytime that you can. Then here we have my concise project description. It's what we're going to do and it's how we're going to do it. Now, earlier in this presentation, I told you that you should make your project description 1 to 3 sentences max, right? This is 4 sentences. So there's always room, there's always wiggle room, but it's just a guide. Okay, so, but because the project description is really logical and straightforward, it's also logos at the same time. Below this, we have a little bit more of that kind of local credibility that I talked about, a little bit more ethos. And then finally, we end on my trademarked mic drop pathos at the end. You really want to hit them with an emotional impact at the end so they really can't say no to your project, right? And I will say that this entire script right here is 276 words, and the minute and the video was 2 minutes and 14 seconds. And even despite how compact it is, I do think that it tells a story, right? Not a narrative, but it communicates a theme. And that theme is what does it mean to live in a rural community? And how can we maintain that, what we love about being in a rural community, while combating this mental health epidemic we find ourselves in? So ultimately, the point is you can do a lot with a little. That's what we're going for here. Now, it's never a bad idea to have a standard pitch for your project that's just always ready to go. You never know when you might have the opportunity to deliver it. However, if you do know that you're going to be delivering a pitch for a very specific audience, be it a foundation or a specific donor, you do want to try and do a little bit of reconnaissance work. Now, if you're talking about a grant application, that's usually really easy. It's usually easier than you would think. So don't get bogged down in it, because most funders, they want to receive applications that are aligned in their work. They want to give you the materials that you need so that you're not wasting their time, right? So all you really need to do is usually look through the website, the RFP or request for proposal, and really kind of any auxiliary information that's attached with the grant. If there's like an FAQ or kind of any other links that you find there with the grant, get them all out, read them with a highlighter in your hand, and look for keywords that you can really zero in on to figure out what are going to be the focus areas of that particular funder or opportunity. So let's go ahead and table our thoughts about the AMB West grant, which is that cycle is already completed for this year. And instead, let's turn our attention on the PCCF grant cycle, which is now open. And many of you are probably writing a proposal for, and it's going to be due March 3rd, 2021. So let's focus our attention on that. And like many places, so PCCF does a fantastic job, spends a lot of time and effort communicating to us about the We Will Park County initiative, and very clearly and cleanly lays out their 5 focus areas. So we know that those are health, safety, and education, economic performance, housing and affordability, small town and rural lifestyle, and landscapes and natural beauty. So it's all right there for us, ready to go, ready to dive in. But let's say we want to do a little bit more of that reconnaissance work. Maybe we want to try and read through the lines even a little bit more. So kind of a fun activity that I like to do sometimes is to use a word cloud. So what I did is I went to the We Will Park County website, and I just copied the text of that page, and then I punched it in this word cloud generator. And this is the word cloud that we get from the We Will Park County page. So obviously, you know, we see Park County is really big in there, but a couple of other words jump out at me as well. So first of all, we have community. Maybe it was saying Park County Community Foundation, but I don't see foundation on there. So I do think it's valid that the word community is really prominent and standing out. I also see both vision and view. And I also see the word support jumps out at me, and the word report, right? So if we want to even better attune how we write our grants for this, we can intuit that they want projects that are community minded and community driven. They want projects that have a view, have a vision, right? And they want projects that offer much needed support. Now, report is very funny and very astute, because many of you will know that reporting is a huge part of grant writing that is not often talked about. So it's just one of those friendly reminders, you know, do your interim report, and remember that you're going to want to be doing reporting the whole time that you're accomplishing your grant process. So I just think of that one as kind of the universe's little joke. But this word cloud exercise, there's tons of free word cloud generators online. And so it's something fun to do with your own organization's mission, or your own organization's webpage, or even your own grant proposal that you write, because it might give you a sense of whether or not you are saying what you think you're saying, right? Okay, now for the sake of time, we are going to skip this part, but what you can do if you're just having so much fun with ethos, pathos, logos, and rhetorical analysis is I would invite you to watch the We Will Park County video and think of it as a pitch and look for the ways that they use ethos, pathos, and logos. And I do have some ways that I've identified it here that you can go back and take a look at later if you have time. But let's wrap this up with a little bit of practical application of what we are talking about today. So we want ethos, pathos, and logos to guide us to create pitches with brevity and precision. And you might be wondering, why do we need to worry about brevity and precision when grant applications are usually very long and actually need a lot of information in them? Well, for one thing, you don't need to use all the characters they give you. Author Stephen King uses the formula second draft equals first draft minus 10%. So that's just a reminder that you can always trim the fat off of anything you write and it will be better for that. But on top of that, we always want to look for kind of like secret opportunities to pitch our project, do this kind of pitch that we're talking about creating within the scope of a grant application. So here's an example. In the community grant application for PCCF, there's a two-part question. It says, please choose one or two focus areas that best align with the proposed outcomes of your project. And we know those 5 focus areas, we already talked about them. And then it says, part 2, it says, please share a few sentences explaining why you selected these focus areas. Okay, so I want to point out a few things. First, it says a few sentences, right? Now, it gives you 2,000 characters to answer that question. So you could put a couple paragraphs, you could write a long thing, but it says, please share a few sentences, and we want to honor those instructions. We don't want to ignore them, right? Next thing, we know that aligning with these focus areas is a really big deal for the success of your grant application. And we know that because they've gone to extensive lengths to communicate what those focus areas are, give us data to explain what they're thinking of with these focus areas. We know that's critical to getting a successful grant application. So I'm completely intuiting this. Honestly, Barb could chime in if she wants to. I don't have insider information. Just as a grant writer, I kind of look for questions that I think might be a little bit more widely viewed, right? Not everybody's going to read your whole packet, but there might be people who are like, what's the story with this affordable housing packet? And then somebody has to advocate for you. They might say, well, and they might share these few sentences that you shared in this question. So there's opportunity. You're busy writing your grant application. You could blow this question off, but I would argue maybe you want to spend a little bit of extra time on a little question like this one. So what we're going to do, we're almost out of time, but I do want to take a couple of minutes, give you guys a couple of minutes to try and generate an answer to this question in 3 parts. So you want to state a fact or a statistic, you want to demonstrate a need, you want to explain how your organization will meet that need in terms of the stated focus areas, which I am listing again on the bottom of the screen. So because we don't have a lot of time, I'm just going to say ready, set, go. See if you can come up with a quick answer to this question. All right, so it's been 2 minutes. If anybody is still working on their response, definitely you can keep working on it. And if anybody wants to share what they have come up with, definitely now's your chance. So now I'm gonna sit quietly like a teacher just for a second in case anybody wants to be brave and share what they have written. Anybody? Well, I'll be brave and I'll share what I've written. And if anybody changes their mind, you still have the chance. So for this question on the actual grant application that I'm really writing for this cycle, if my thing doesn't want to change, here we go. Okay, there it is. So I wrote, at the time of this writing, there is only one home listed for sale in Gardner, Montana. The price for this house is over $900,000 in a community with a median income of $43,000 per year. The housing situation in Gardner has made it all but impossible for our school to hire and retain teachers. By working to provide affordable teacher housing alongside all the ways we support Gardner School, North Yellowstone Education Foundation's work aligns most clearly with the focus areas of health, safety, and education, and housing and affordability. And you can see that it very, very clearly breaks down in logos, pathos, and ethos, which included both a mention of my project and the focus areas that I'm trying to align with. So it's very clean cut and it comes together really well. So anytime you speak about your project, you want your words to paint a picture, to stir in emotion, and to seem doable, realistic, and above all, real. So by starting with a crisp, concise project description and then using ethos, pathos, and logos to guide you, hopefully you'll be able to put together a project pitch that is enthusiastic, efficient, and wildly effective. So here's my info. You should know that I am available if you do have specific questions about a grant that you would like to get my feedback on. Feel free to reach out and email me. I am available for more professional kind of consulting and grant writing services if you want to talk about that as well. But I'm always happy to chat about grants. They are my passion. And here is a list of just some additional resources, things that I mentioned in the grant, in the presentation. I didn't talk about the words to minutes calculator, but I love to know always how many words are in something that I've put together and how many minutes it would take for me to say out loud. So that's just a neat little tool that I like to use. And that's it. So if anybody has questions, let's have it.